Pride and Prejudice Study Guide. Pride and Prejudice is Jane Austen's first novel, published in 1813. Some scholars also consider it one of her most mature novels. Austen began writing Pride and Prejudice under the title First Impressions in 1796, at the age of 21. She probably wrote the first draft as an epistolary novel, meaning the plot unfolded through an exchange of letters. In 1797, Austen's father offered his daughter's manuscript to a publishing company, but they refused to even consider it. Shortly after completing First Impressions, Austen began writing Sense and Sensibility, which was not published until 1811. She also wrote some shorter stories during this time, which she later expanded into full novels. Between 1810 and 1812, Austen rewrote Pride and Prejudice for publication. While the original ideas in the novel came from a 21-year-old girl, the final version reflects the literary and thematic maturity of a 35-year-old woman who had spent years painstakingly drafting and revising, as Austen did with all of her novels. Pride and Prejudice is the most popular of Austen's novels. Pride and Prejudice Summary. Pride and Prejudice is set primarily in the county of Hertfordshire, about 50 miles outside of London. The story centers on the Bennet family, particularly Elizabeth. The novel opens at Longbourn, the Bennet family's estate. Mr. and Mrs. Bennet have 5 children: Jane, Elizabeth, Mary, Kitty, and Lydia. The family engages in a conversation about Mr. Bingley, a single man of large fortune who will be renting the nearby estate of Netherfield Park. Mrs. Bennet sees Mr. Bingley as a potential suitor for one of her daughters. The Bennets first meet Mr. Bingley and his companions at the Meryton Ball. The townspeople conclude that Mr. Bingley is perfectly amiable and agreeable. Meanwhile, Mr. Bingley takes an immediate liking to Jane Bennet. Mr. Bingley's friend Mr. Darcy, however, snubs Elizabeth. The community decides that Darcy is proud and disagreeable because of his reserve and his refusal to dance. Jane finds Bingley's sisters, Caroline and Mrs. Hurst, to be amiable, but Elizabeth sees them as arrogant. After further interactions, it becomes evident that Jane and Bingley are interested in one another. However, while Bingley makes his partiality quite obvious, Jane is universally cheerful and somewhat shy. Charlotte Lucas, Elizabeth's best friend, has a very pragmatic view of marriage. She recommends that Jane make her regard for Bingley more obvious. At the same time, Mr. Darcy begins to admire Elizabeth, captivated by her fine eyes and lively wit. She, however, remains contemptuous towards him. When Jane is invited for dinner at Netherfield, Mrs. Bennet refuses to provide her with a carriage, hoping that the impending rainstorm will force her to spend the night there. After getting caught in the rain, Jane actually falls ill and has to remain at Netherfield for many days. Upon hearing that Jane is ill, Elizabeth walks to Bingley's estate through the muddy fields. Caroline Bingley and Mrs. Hurst are scandalized by Elizabeth's rumpled appearance, but join Bingley in welcoming her nonetheless. Elizabeth continues to impress Darcy during her time nursing Jane at Netherfield. However, she remains blind to his affections and continues to see him as a proud and haughty man. Caroline, who hopes to attract Mr. Darcy herself, grows extremely jealous of Elizabeth and mocks her lowly status. Mrs. Bennet and her younger daughters come to Netherfield to check on Jane, and Elizabeth is mortified by their foolish behavior and complete lack of manners. Bingley's admiration for Jane continues unabated, though, and his affection is evident in his genuine solicitude for her recovery. After Jane recovers, she returns home with Elizabeth. Meanwhile, a militia regiment is stationed at the nearby town of Meryton, where Mrs. Bennet's sister Mrs. Phillips lives. Mrs. Phillips is just as foolish as Mrs. Bennet. Lydia and Kitty love to stay with their aunt in Meryton so they can socialize, and flirt, with the military officers. Mr. Collins, Mr. Bennet's distant cousin, writes a letter stating his intention to visit. Collins is in line to inherit Longbourn because the estate has been entailed away from any female children. Mr. Collins is a clergyman, and his patroness, Lady Catherine de Bourgh, who is also Darcy's aunt, has suggested that he find a wife. Therefore, Collins hopes to make amends for the entailment by marrying one of Mr. Bennet's daughters. Mr. Collins proves himself to be a silly man, speaking in long, pompous speeches with an air of solemn formality. The Miss Bennets and Mr. Collins go for a walk to Meryton. On the way, they meet an officer in the regiment named Mr. Wickham. They also run into Mr. Darcy. When Darcy and Wickham see one another, both men become visibly uncomfortable. Wickham shows an immediate partiality for Elizabeth, and they speak at length over the following days. In one of these conversations, Wickham explains his past with Darcy. Darcy's father had promised that Wickham, his godson, would inherit a good living after the elder man's death. However, Darcy failed to fulfill his father's dying wishes and left Wickham to support himself. Elizabeth, already predisposed to think badly of Darcy, does not question Wickham's account. When Elizabeth tells Wickham's story to Jane, however, Jane refuses to think badly of either Wickham or Darcy, insisting that there must be some misunderstanding. Bingley hosts a ball at Netherfield. He and Jane spend the whole evening together and their mutual attachment becomes increasingly obvious. However, Mrs. Bennet speaks loudly about their imminent engagement, and Elizabeth notes that Darcy overhears her. Later that evening, Darcy asks Elizabeth to dance and she reluctantly accepts. She does not enjoy it and cannot understand why he asked her. Mr. Collins pays particularly close attention to Elizabeth at the ball, and even reserves the first 2 dances with her. The next day, Mr. Collins proposes to Elizabeth. She refuses, but it takes him a while to accept her rejection. He assumes she is simply playing coy, as he believes females do. Mrs. Bennet is extremely angry at Elizabeth for refusing Collins, but Mr. Bennet is glad. Mr. Collins quickly shifts his attentions to Charlotte Lucas. He proposes to Charlotte, and she accepts. Elizabeth is disappointed in her friend for agreeing to marry such a silly man simply for the sake of financial security. Bingley travels to London for business but plans to return to Netherfield. His sisters and Darcy soon follow him. Soon thereafter, Caroline writes to Jane to say that Bingley has changed his plans and will not return to Netherfield for at least 6 months. Caroline also informs Jane that she hopes Bingley will marry Darcy's younger sister in order to unite the 2 families' fortunes. Jane is heartbroken. Elizabeth thinks that Darcy and Bingley's sisters have somehow managed to dissuade Bingley from proposing to Jane. Mr. and Mrs. Gardiner, Elizabeth's aunt and uncle, come to Longbourn to visit. Noting Jane's sadness, they invite her to stay with them in London for a while. Elizabeth hopes that Jane will run into Bingley while in London. Mrs. Gardiner warns Elizabeth against marrying Wickham because of his poor financial situation. While Jane is in London, Caroline Bingley is extremely rude to her. Jane assumes that Mr. Bingley knows she is in London, and since he does not call, she decides he no longer cares for her. In Meryton, Wickham suddenly transfers his attentions from Elizabeth to Miss King, a woman who has recently acquired £10,000 from an inheritance. Elizabeth travels to visit Charlotte, now Mrs. Collins, at her new home in Kent, along with Sir William Lucas and Maria Lucas. On their way, the travellers stop to visit Jane and the Gardiners. Mrs. Gardiner criticizes Wickham's change of affections, but Elizabeth defends him. During her stay in Hunsford, Elizabeth and the others are often invited to dine at Rosings, Lady Catherine's large estate. Lady Catherine is completely arrogant and domineering. After Elizabeth has been at the parsonage for 2 weeks, Mr. Darcy and his cousin Colonel Fitzwilliam visit Rosings. Elizabeth and Colonel Fitzwilliam get along very well. Darcy also pays a lot of attention to Elizabeth and often visits the parsonage. He also purposely meets her during her daily walks through the nearby gardens. One day, Colonel Fitzwilliam mentions to Elizabeth that Darcy recently saved a close friend from an imprudent marriage. Elizabeth realizes that Fitzwilliam is referring to Bingley and Jane. She is so angry at Darcy that she gives herself a headache, which keeps her from visiting Rosings that night. Darcy visits Jane while she is alone at the parsonage and confesses that he wants to marry her despite her low family connections. Elizabeth is shocked at his arrogant address and rudely refuses him. She also rebukes him for acting in such an ungentlemanly manner and accuses him of ruining Jane's future happiness and betraying Wickham. Darcy is shocked that Elizabeth has declined his proposal and leaves. The next day, Darcy finds Elizabeth and hands her a letter. She reads it after he is gone. First, Darcy defends himself for dissuading Bingley from proposing to Jane. Not only were Jane's family connections low, but she did not seem to show any particular preference for Bingley. Darcy then details his side of the Wickham story. Before his death, Darcy's father asked Darcy to provide Wickham with a living, provided Wickham enter the clergy. Wickham, however, did not want to enter the clergy, and asked Darcy for £3,000 to study law. Wickham soon squandered all his money on a dissolute lifestyle and then asked Darcy for another stipend, promising to enter the clergy this time. When Darcy refused, Wickham seduced Darcy's teenage sister, Georgiana. Before they could elope, Darcy intervened and saved Georgiana's honor. Elizabeth initially refuses to believe Darcy's claims, but comes to consider the possibility as she reflects on Wickham's behavior. She realizes she was inclined to believe Wickham because she was prejudiced against Darcy and because she was flattered by his attention. Soon afterwards, Elizabeth returns home, stopping to collect Jane on the way. Meanwhile, Mrs. Bennet, Lydia, and Kitty are upset because the regiment is leaving Meryton and moving on to Brighton. Lydia is then invited to join Colonel Forster and Mrs. Forster in Brighton. Elizabeth advises her father to refuse Lydia's request, believing that her sister's frivolous nature will get her in trouble there. However, Mr. Bennet does not heed Elizabeth's advice. Soon afterwards, Elizabeth goes on vacation with the Gardiners. Their first stop is close to Pemberley, Mr. Darcy's estate. The Gardiners want to take a tour, and Elizabeth only agrees once she learns that Darcy is currently away. During their tour of the estate, Mrs. Reynolds, the Pemberley housekeeper, praises Darcy unequivocally. Elizabeth also expresses some regret that she will never be mistress of this estate. The travellers suddenly run into Darcy, who has arrived early. Surprisingly, Darcy is extremely cordial to both Elizabeth and the Gardiners. He tells Elizabeth that he wants her to meet Georgiana as soon as she arrives the next day. The next morning, Darcy and Georgiana visit Elizabeth and the Gardiners at their inn. Bingley soon joins them, and Elizabeth can see that he still thinks fondly of Jane. Elizabeth and Mrs. Gardiner return the courtesy by visiting Pemberley, where Bingley's sisters treat them quite rudely. One morning, Elizabeth receives a letter from Jane, announcing that Lydia has eloped with Wickham. Worse yet, the family fears that Wickham does not actually intend to marry her. Jane asks Elizabeth to return home immediately. As soon as Elizabeth reads the letter, Darcy arrives at the inn. In her frantic state, Elizabeth tells him what has happened. Darcy feels partially to blame, since he never publicly exposed Wickham's wickedness. Elizabeth and the Gardiners depart for Longbourn almost immediately. There, a hysterical Mrs. Bennet has locked herself in her room. They learn from Colonel Forster that Wickham has amassed over £1,000 of gambling debts. The next day, Mr. Gardiner leaves for London to join Mr. Bennet, who is already there looking for Lydia. After many days of fruitless searching, Mr. Bennet returns home, leaving the search in Mr. Gardiner's hands. Soon, a letter arrives from Mr. Gardiner announcing that Lydia and Wickham have been found. Wickham has agreed to marry Lydia if Mr. Bennet provides her with her equal share of his wealth. Considering the size of his debts, Mr. Bennet knows that Wickham would never have agreed to marry Lydia for so little money. He concludes that Mr. Gardiner must have paid off Wickham's debts to solidify the deal. After their marriage, Lydia and Wickham visit Longbourn. Lydia is not the least bit remorseful for her conduct. Nevertheless, Mrs. Bennet is very happy to have one of her daughters married. At dinner, Lydia lets it slip to Elizabeth that Darcy was present at her wedding. Curious, Elizabeth writes to Mrs. Gardiner for details. Her aunt explains that it was Darcy who found Lydia and Wickham and paid off Wickham's debts. Mrs. Gardiner believes that Darcy did this out of love for Elizabeth. Bingley and Mr. Darcy soon return to Netherfield Park, and they call at Longbourn frequently. After several days, Bingley proposes to Jane. She accepts, and the family is very happy. In the meantime, Darcy leaves on a short business trip to London. While he is gone, Lady Catherine comes to Longbourn, furious after hearing a rumour that Elizabeth and Darcy are engaged. She forbids Elizabeth from ever accepting a proposal from Mr. Darcy, but Elizabeth is completely offended and refuses to promise anything. Lady Catherine leaves in a huff. After returning from his trip, Darcy tells Elizabeth that his affection has not changed. She then reveals that her feelings have changed and that she would be happy to marry him. They discuss how and why their sentiments have changed since Darcy's first proposal. Darcy has since realized he was wrong to act so proudly and place so much emphasis on class differences. Elizabeth, meanwhile, accepts that she was wrong to judge Darcy prematurely and admits that she allowed her vanity to affect her judgment. Both couples marry. Elizabeth and Darcy live at Pemberley. After living in Netherfield for a year, Jane and Bingley move to an estate near Pemberley. Lydia and Wickham tire of each other eventually, and Lydia keeps asking her sisters for money. Kitty spends most of her time with her two elder sisters, and her education and character begin to improve. Mary remains at home to keep her mother company. Mr. Bennet is very happy that his two oldest daughters have married so happily, and Mrs. Bennet is glad that her daughters have married so prosperously. Pride and Prejudice character list. Elizabeth. The novel's protagonist and the second oldest of her 5 sisters, Elizabeth Bennet is lively, quick-witted, sharp-tongued, bold, and intelligent. She is keen and perceptive, but Elizabeth's pride in that very ability engenders a prejudice that almost hinders her happy future with Darcy. Elizabeth is not impressed by mere wealth or titles, rather, she values propriety, good manners, and virtue. Mr. Darcy. An extremely wealthy aristocrat, Mr. Darcy is proud, haughty, and extremely conscious of class differences, at least at the beginning of the novel. He does, however, have a strong sense of honor and virtue and a degree of fairness that helps him to control his pride after Elizabeth rebukes him for his narrow-minded perspective. Jane. Jane Bennet, the oldest Bennet daughter, is beautiful, good-tempered, amiable, humble, and selfless. Her good nature does result in a level of naivete, especially when it comes to recognizing the wickedness of others. Her sweetness leaves her vulnerable to injury from insincere friends like Caroline Bingley. A rather static character, Jane remains a model of virtue throughout the novel. Mr. Bingley. Much like his beloved Jane, Charles Bingley is an amiable and good-tempered person, mostly unconcerned with class differences despite his extraordinary wealth. His virtue proves to be his vice at times, since his modesty leads him to be easily swayed by the opinions of others. A mostly static character, Bingley remains pleasant and in love with Jane throughout the novel. Mr. Wickham. An officer in the regiment stationed at Meryton, Officer Wickham possesses a charm that hides his dissolute, untrustworthy personality. He was godson to Darcy's father. However, Wickham betrayed Darcy by seducing Georgiana when she was only 15. He also spreads false rumours about Darcy throughout Hertfordshire and Meryton. Overall, Wickham is driven by self-interest, revealed by his many romantic engagements, or lack thereof, in the case of Elizabeth. He is also a static character and marries Lydia only because Darcy provides a financial incentive. In the epilogue, Austen implies that Wickham tires of Lydia after a certain point. Mrs. Bennet. Mrs. Bennet is a foolish and frivolous woman. She lacks any sense of propriety and neglects to provide her daughters with a proper education. Instead, she remains concerned solely with securing them profitable marriages. Her lack of self-awareness constantly embarrasses Elizabeth and Mr. Bennet alike. Mr. Bennet. An intelligent man with good sense, Mr. Bennet displays an unfortunate disinterest in most of his family, besides Elizabeth. He seems weary after spending many decades married to the interminable Mrs. Bennet. His complacency is shaken only when Lydia's poor decisions in Brighton threaten her future. Lydia. The youngest of the Bennet sisters, Lydia Bennet is foolish and flirtatious. She gratifies her every whim without considering the consequences. She is Mrs. Bennet's favorite daughter because they share similar, though frivolous, interests. She is obsessed with the regiment officers, and lets her lack of virtue and propriety lead her into a near disaster with Wickham. Kitty. Catherine Kitty Bennet, the second youngest Bennet daughter, exhibits little personality of her own. Instead, she imitates Lydia in almost everything until Lydia leaves for Brighton. The epilogue leads the reader to hope that Kitty's character improves as a result of spending time with her elder sisters instead of Lydia. Mary. The middle Bennet sister, Mary, is strangely solemn and pedantic. She dislikes going out into society and prefers to spend her time studying. In conversation, Mary constantly makes awkward and profound observations about human nature and life in general. Some critics believe Mary was a cipher for Austen herself. Mr. Collins. Mr. Collins is a distant cousin of the Bennet family to whom Longbourn has been entailed. He is mostly a comic character because of his awkward mix of obsequiousness and pride, as well as the tiresome formalities of his speech. Even after he marries Charlotte Lucas, Mr. Collins remains largely unchanged. Charlotte. Charlotte Lucas is Elizabeth's best friend, the Bennets' neighbour, and Sir William's daughter. Her attitudes on marriage, as a pragmatic transaction rather than as a romantic attachment, stand in stark contrast to Elizabeth's. She eventually marries Mr. Collins after Elizabeth rejects his proposal. Sir William Lucas. Sir William Lucas is a friend and neighbour of the Bennet family. He is pleasant but not overly deep or intellectual. He is obsessed with having been granted knighthood. He is father to Charlotte and Maria Lucas. Maria Lucas. Charlotte's younger sister, Maria, is as empty-headed as her father. She is never featured in the novel outside of her presence on the trip to visit Charlotte with Sir William and Elizabeth. Mrs. Gardiner. Mrs. Bennet's sister-in-law acts as a level-headed maternal figure to Elizabeth and Jane, compensating for Mrs. Bennet's inadequacy in this regard. She is an intelligent, caring and sensible woman. Austen uses the Gardiners as a means to explore the value of personality over class distinction. Mr. Gardiner. Elizabeth's maternal uncle is a merchant, and an upright and intelligent man. Though he is in a lower social class than the Bennets are, Mr. Gardiner is respectful and distinguished, even impressing Darcy with his mannered behaviour. Caroline Bingley. Caroline Bingley is Bingley's youngest sister. She is a superficial and selfish girl, possessing all of Darcy's class prejudice but none of his honour and virtue. Throughout the novel, she panders to Darcy in an attempt to win his affections, but to no avail. Her cruelty towards Jane and Elizabeth marks her as a generally unpleasant character. Mrs. Hurst. Bingley's elder sister, Mrs. Hurst, is just as arrogant as Caroline, though she is less involved in attacking the Bennet sisters. She seems to have no real affection or esteem for her husband. Mr. Hurst. Mr. Bingley's brother-in-law is an indolent man. Mr. Hurst does almost nothing but eat and entertain himself by playing cards. He never says an intelligent word in the entire novel, and seems to be solely concerned with the quality of the food. Georgiana Darcy. Darcy's sister Georgiana, 10 years his junior, is quiet and shy but generally amiable and good-natured. She has great reverence and affection for her brother and gets along well with Elizabeth from their first meeting. Bingley's sisters had hoped that Mr. Bingley would marry Georgiana, thus uniting the fortunes of the two families. Lady Catherine. Lady Catherine de Bourgh, Darcy's aristocratic aunt and Mr. Collins's patroness, is a sharp-tongued woman obsessed with flaunting her wealth and social superiority. She advises people without solicitation on every aspect of their lives and suffers only flattery. Miss de Bourgh. Lady Catherine's daughter, Miss de Bourgh, is a frail, weak, and sickly woman who is overly pampered by her mother. She speaks little in the novel, but seems to be generally good-natured. Lady Catherine had wanted Darcy to marry Miss de Bourgh, which is the main reason she disapproves of Darcy's union with Elizabeth. Colonel Fitzwilliam. Colonel Fitzwilliam is Mr. Darcy's cousin who accompanies him on his visit to Lady Catherine's home. He is a pleasant and amiable gentleman who shows an interest in Elizabeth, but then confesses he can only marry someone with a large fortune because of his status as a youngest son. Mrs. Phillips. Mrs. Phillips is Mrs. Bennet's sister who shares her foolishness and frivolity. She lives in Meryton and facilitates Lydia and Kitty's obsession with the officers stationed there. Mrs. Forster. Mrs. Forster is the wife of Colonel Forster and invites Lydia to accompany them to Brighton. The trip enables the near disaster with Wickham. Mrs. Forster's frivolous nature is implied by her fellowship with Lydia. Colonel Forster. A good-natured and basically responsible man, Colonel Forster is the regiment leader who allows his wife to bring Lydia to Brighton. After the disastrous elopement, Colonel Forster helps Mr. Gardiner and Mr. Bennet to locate Lydia. Miss Young. Miss Young was Georgiana Darcy's governess back when Wickham seduced the young girl. In fact, Miss Young was crucial towards facilitating Wickham's wickedness. She never features directly in the novel, but she proves to be the key in Darcy's locating Wickham and Lydia. Mrs. Lucas. Mrs. Lucas is married to Sir William and is Charlotte and Maria's mother. Mrs. Bennet often taunts Mrs. Lucas with gossip about the potential marital success of the Bennet girls. Mr. Denny. Mr. Denny is a soldier in the regiment who introduces the Bennet girls to Mr. Wickham. Miss King. Wickham pursues Miss King, a woman in Meryton, after she inherits a sum of money. Her inheritance distracts Wickham from his flirtation with Elizabeth. Mrs. Jenkinson. Mrs. Jenkinson missed a Bow's companion. She pampers the young girl. Mrs. Reynolds. Mrs. Reynolds is the estate's longtime housekeeper. She gives Elizabeth and the Gardiners a tour of Pemberley and impresses Elizabeth with her praise of Darcy. Mrs. Annesley. Mrs. Annesley is Georgiana's companion at Pemberley. She shows great civility towards Elizabeth and Mrs. Gardiner when they visit, even though Bingley's sisters are rude to them. Pride and Prejudice Glossary. Barouche box. A type of horse-drawn carriage that was fashionable in the 19th century. Circumspection. The quality of being wary and unwilling to take risks, prudence. Dissipation. Squandering of money, energy, or resources. Entail. A settlement of the inheritance of property over a number of generations so that it remains within a family or other group. In the case of the novel, the Longbourn estate is entailed so that it always stays within the male line. Ineffectual. Not producing any or the desired effect. Livery. Special uniform worn by a servant or official. Michaelmas. The Feast of Saint Michael, September 29. Obsequiousness. The quality of being characterized by or showing servile complaisance or deference. Officiousness. The quality of telling others what to do without solicitation. Ordination. The action of ordaining or conferring holy orders on someone. Ostentatious. Showy or flamboyant. Panegyric. A public speech or published text in praise of someone or something. Parsonage. A church house provided for a member of the clergy. Pecuniary. Of, relating to, or consisting of money. Phaeton. A light, open, four-wheeled horse-drawn carriage. Querulous. Whiny or complaining. Regiment. A permanent unit of an army typically commanded by a colonel and divided into several companies, squadrons, or batteries, and often separated into 2 battalions. Solicitude. Care or concern for someone or something. Steward. One who manages or looks after another's property. Toilette. The process of washing oneself, dressing, and attending to one's appearance. Pride and Prejudice themes. Pride. As Mary says in Chapter 5, human nature is particularly prone to pride. Throughout Pride and Prejudice, pride prevents the characters from seeing the truth of a situation. Most notably, it is one of the 2 primary barriers in the way of a union between Elizabeth and Darcy. Darcy's pride in his social position leads him to scorn anyone outside of his own social circle. Meanwhile, Elizabeth's pride in her powers of discernment cloud her judgment. These two find happiness by helping each other overcome his/her pride. Outside of Elizabeth and Darcy, however, Austen seems pessimistic about the human ability to conquer this character flaw. A slew of secondary characters, like Mrs. Bennet, Lady Catherine, Mr. Collins, and Caroline Bingley, remain deluded by personal pride throughout the novel. Prejudice. Critic A. Walton Litz comments, "In Pride and Prejudice one cannot equate Darcy with pride, or Elizabeth with prejudice. Darcy's pride of place is founded on social prejudice, while Elizabeth's initial prejudice against him is rooted in pride of her own quick perceptions. Ultimately, both characters' egos drive them towards personal prejudice. Darcy has been taught to scorn anyone outside his own social circle and must overcome his prejudice in order to endear himself to Elizabeth. Similarly, Elizabeth's excessive pride in her discernment leads her write Darcy off too quickly. Ultimately, they find happiness by recognizing the barriers that prejudice creates." Family. Austen portrays the family unit as primarily responsible for the intellectual and moral education of children. Throughout the novel, the younger characters either benefit from or suffer from their family values. Mr. and Mrs. Bennet's failure to provide their daughters with a proper education leads to Lydia's utter foolishness and immorality. Elizabeth and Jane manage to develop virtue and discernment in spite of their parents' negligence, though it is notable that they have other role models, like the Gardiners. Darcy shares his father's aristocratic nature and tendency towards generosity, while Lady Catherine's formidable parenting style has rendered her daughter too frightened to speak. Women. Austen is certainly critical of the gender injustices present in 19th-century English society, particularly as perpetrated by the institution of marriage. In Pride and Prejudice, many women, such as Charlotte, must marry solely for the sake of financial security. However, in her portrayal of Elizabeth, Austen shows that women are just as intelligent and capable as their male counterparts. Jane Austen herself went against convention by remaining single and earning a living through her novels. In her personal letters, Austen advised friends only to marry for love. In the novel, Elizabeth's happy ending reveals Austen's beliefs that woman has the right to remain independent until she meets the right man, if she meets him. On the other hand, most contemporary readers will find the Longbourn entailment to be unjust. And yet the heroines, Jane and Elizabeth, refrain from speaking out against it. Instead, the only two characters who openly criticize the entailment, Mrs. Bennet and Lady Catherine, are ridiculous caricatures. Furthermore, the fact that Elizabeth seems to share her father's distrust frivolous women suggests Austen's uneasy relationship with her own gender. Class. Class issues are everywhere in Pride and Prejudice. While the novel never posits an egalitarian ideology nor supports the leveling of all social classes, it does criticize an overemphasis on class, especially in terms of judging a person's character. Ultimately, the novel accepts Elizabeth's view that the trappings of wealth are not a virtue in and of themselves. Darcy's initial pride is based on his extreme class consciousness, but he eventually comes to accept Elizabeth's perspective, most notably evidenced through his admiration of the Gardiners. Likewise, he joins Elizabeth in rejecting the upper-class characters who are idle, mean-spirited, closed-minded, like Lady Catherine and Bingley's sisters. Austen clearly finds rigid class boundaries to be occasionally absurd. Mr. Collins's comic formality and obsequious relationship with Lady Catherine form a satire of class consciousness and social formalities. In the end, the novel's verdict on class differences is moderate. Austen seems to accept the existence of class hierarchy, but she also criticizes the way it can poison society. Critic Samuel Kleiger notes, if the conclusion of the novel makes it clear that Elizabeth accepts class relationships as valid, it becomes equally clear that Darcy, through Elizabeth's genius for treating all people with respect for their natural dignity, is reminded that institutions are not an end in themselves but are intended to serve the end of human happiness. Individual versus society. In Pride and Prejudice, Austen portrays a world in which society is actively involved in the private lives of individuals. Characters often face questions about their responsibility to the world around them. A prime example is Darcy's guilt for not having publicly shamed Wickham before he was able to elope with Lydia. After all, Lydia's sin threatens to besmirch not only her family, but the community at large. And yet Austen seems quite well aware of how easily public opinion can change, as evidenced by the town's easily shifting opinions on Wickham. Elizabeth, meanwhile, is proudly independent and individualistic. She possesses the ability to transcend her limitations, the negligence of her parents, the frivolity of Meryton, the pragmatic nature of Charlotte, because she is confident enough to go after what she wants. However, her individualistic nature misleads her as she works through her feelings for Darcy, but thankfully, Mrs. Gardiner is there to guide her towards him. Ultimately, Austen is critical of the power public opinion has on individual action, but she also believes that society has a crucial role in promoting virtue and therefore, engendering individual happiness. According to critic Richard Simpson, Austen portrays a thorough consciousness that man is a social being, and that apart from society there is not even the individual. Virtue. Austen's novels unite Aristotelian and Christian conceptions of virtue. She sees human life as purposeful and believes that human beings must guide their appetites and desires through their use of reason. For instance, Elizabeth almost loses her chance at happiness because her vanity overcomes her pragmatism. Lydia's lack of virtue is linked with her inability to control her passion and desire. Most of these examples emphasize the importance of self-awareness. Without knowing oneself, it is difficult to develop virtue. Darcy and Elizabeth, two of the only characters who actually change in the novel, can only see past their pride and prejudice with each other's help. In the end, Austen links happiness to virtue and virtue to self-awareness. Pride and Prejudice quotes an analysis. It is a truth universally acknowledged, that a single man in possession of a good fortune, must be in want of a wife. Narrator, Volume I, Chapter 1. In the first line of the novel, Austen reveals two of its primary themes, marriage and class, particularly as indicated by money. In the world of Pride and Prejudice, individuals are defined by their marital opportunities and financial holdings. However, the irony in this line conceals an implicit criticism. The line's grammatical focus is on a single man in want of a wife, but Austen's novel is centered on her female characters as they struggle to succeed within this oppressive patriarchy. Each Miss Bennet knows that without a husband of decent means and status, she risks living a life as a powerless and potentially destitute spinster. That Austen can imply such a desperate reality in a superficially breezy and straightforward line is evidence of her mastery. Pride is a very common failing, I believe. By all that I have ever read, I am convinced that it is very common indeed, that human nature is particularly prone to it, and that there are very few of us who do not cherish a feeling of self-complacency on the score of some quality or other, real or imaginary. Vanity and pride are different things, though the words are often used synonymously. A person may be proud without being vain. Pride relates more to our opinion of ourselves, vanity to what we would have others think of us. Mary Bennet, Volume I, Chapter 5. Mary gives the reader a lens through which to understand one of the novel's central conceits. On the surface, Mary offers simple definitions of pride and vanity. Her speech also indicates that these attributes are very common. Therefore, she implies that it is best to acknowledge one's tendency towards such behavior. However, at the beginning of Pride and Prejudice, both Elizabeth and Darcy believe that they are above pride and vanity. They think they can exist outside these cultural norms, but are ultimately forced to accept that they do in fact exist in the context of a greater society. They have responsibilities to others, and should consider to some extent how their family and friends perceive them. It is sometimes a disadvantage to be so very guarded. If a woman conceals her affection with the same skill from the object of it, she may lose the opportunity of fixing him, and it will then be but poor consolation to believe the world equally in the dark. There is so much of gratitude or vanity in almost every attachment, that it is not safe to leave any to itself. We can all begin freely, a slight preference is natural enough, but there are very few of us who have heart enough to be really in love without encouragement. In 9 cases out of 10 a woman had better show more affection than she feels. Charlotte Lucas, Volume I, Chapter 6. On one hand, Charlotte's pragmatic view of love stands in stark contrast to the more romantic worldview that Elizabeth, and presumably, Austen herself, possesses. However, Charlotte's philosophy reflects the unfortunate reality that the women in Pride and Prejudice must face. They live in a patriarchal society. If a man remains single, his greatest risk is loneliness. However, an unmarried woman faces a potential lack of financial security. In Charlotte's eyes, this social inequality means that a woman must consider employing manipulation for the sake of her future. Charlotte follows her own advice when she shows more affection than she feels towards Mr. Collins in order to secure a proposal. Though Elizabeth's happy ending suggests that it is not always necessary for a woman to be as pragmatic as Charlotte, her philosophy nevertheless serves as a criticism of a world that so limits a woman's agency. Happiness in marriage is entirely a matter of chance. If the dispositions of the parties are ever so well known to each other or ever so similar beforehand, it does not advance their felicity in the least. They always continue to grow sufficiently unlike afterwards to have their share of vexation, and it is better to know as little as possible of the defects of the person with whom you are to pass your life. Charlotte, Volume I, Chapter 6. Charlotte's pragmatic view of love and marriage actually conceals her fear and desperation. She sees love as irrelevant to a marriage and believes that a woman ought to limit her intimacy with her husband in order to avoid the inevitable disappointments. This indicates that Charlotte sees a husband as a commodity or means to an end. Even though Elizabeth criticizes Charlotte's recommendation, there was sadly a great deal of truth to it in Jane Austen's time. Charlotte is aware that if her expectations for a mate are too high, she risks becoming a struggling spinster. If she lowers her standards, though, she may not find love but at least she will be comfortable. She was shown into the breakfast parlour, where all but Jane were assembled, and where her appearance created a great deal of surprise. That she should have walked 3 miles so early in the day, in such dirty weather, and by herself, was almost incredible to Mrs. Hurst and Miss Bingley, and Elizabeth was convinced that they held her in contempt for it. She was received, however, very politely by them, and in their brother's manners there was something better than politeness, there was good humour and kindness. Mr. Darcy said very little, and Mr. Hurst nothing at all. The former was divided between admiration of the brilliancy which exercise had given to her complexion, and doubt as to the occasions justifying her coming so far alone. The latter was thinking only of his breakfast. Narrator, Volume I, Chapter 7. Elizabeth is worried about Jane and has no carriage, so she walks alone through the muddy fields to Netherfield. While society considers this kind of behaviour to be unladylike, Elizabeth's concern for her sister trumps these social graces. The Bingley sisters describe Elizabeth's behaviour as dirty and incredible behind her back. However, the Bingley women treat Elizabeth politely, revealing the dishonesty inherent in adhering to social convention. Meanwhile, the uncomplicated Mr. Bingley enjoys the simple fun of Elizabeth's adventure. Darcy's mixed reaction reveals his confusion about his feelings for Elizabeth. His doubt reflects his acknowledgement of social expectations, but he cannot help but feel admiration for Elizabeth's individuality. No, I have made no such pretension. I have faults enough, but they are not, I hope, of understanding. My temper I dare not vouch for. It is, I believe, too little yielding, certainly too little for the convenience of the world. I cannot forget the follies and vices of others so soon as I ought, nor their offences against myself. My feelings are not puffed about with every attempt to move them. My temper would perhaps be called resentful. My good opinion once lost, is lost forever. Mr. Darcy, Volume I, Chapter 11. If Pride and Prejudice is largely about Darcy and Elizabeth gaining self-awareness, then this statement, which Darcy delivers to Elizabeth during her stay at Netherfield, embodies the way Darcy initially sees himself. There is a certain irony in Darcy's honesty. While he seems to exhibit complete self-awareness, he is somewhat oblivious. His pride is so great that he openly refuses to question his own self-perception. Therefore, he actually lacks self-awareness. Elizabeth is shocked by Darcy's arrogant dismissal here, but she has similar pride in her own disposition. Later, Darcy will realize that his pride has concealed the limits of his first impressions, as in the case of Jane, while Elizabeth will realize that she harbors a great deal of prejudice as well. She had dressed with more than usual care, and prepared in the highest spirits for the conquest of all that remained unsubdued of his heart, trusting that it was not more than might be won in the course of the evening. But in an instant arose the dreadful suspicion of his being purposely omitted for Mr. Darcy's pleasure in the Bingleys' invitation to the officers, and though this was not exactly the case, the absolute fact of his absence was pronounced by his friend Denny, to whom Lydia eagerly applied, and who told them that Wickham had been obliged to go to town on business the day before, and was not yet returned, adding, with a significant smile, "I do not imagine his business would have called him away just now, if he had not wanted to avoid a certain gentleman here." Narrator, Volume I, Chapter 18. This passage reveals that Elizabeth is far more affected by her pride and prejudice than she realizes. She openly criticizes Darcy for these faults, not understanding that she suffers from them as well. Her prejudice blinds her to the fact that Wickham's claims might not be entirely truthful. The opening part of the passage reveals the cause of Elizabeth's unyielding prejudice against Darcy, her pride. Wickham has flattered her, which clouds her usual discernment. Although she usually cares little for social expectations, Elizabeth betrays her vanity by dressing with more than usual care. "You are mistaken, Mr. Darcy, if you suppose that the mode of your declaration affected me in any other way, than as it spared me the concern which I might have felt in refusing you, had you behaved in a more gentlemanlike manner." Elizabeth Bennet, Volume 2, Chapter 11. When Elizabeth refuses Darcy's first proposal, she attacks his pride. Darcy clearly expects a positive response, which reveals his arrogance. However, Elizabeth's claim that Darcy's manner is not gentlemanlike shows that she judges him based on his behavior rather than his aristocratic standing. He can wear the label of a gentleman, but that doesn't necessarily mean that his behavior is always appropriate. This particular statement causes Darcy great consternation. Elizabeth therefore forces him to re-evaluate how he sees himself and consider his personality separate from his social position. "How despicably I have acted! I, who have prided myself on my discernment. I, who have valued myself on my abilities. Who have often disdained the generous candor of my sister, and gratified my vanity in useless or blamable mistrust. How humiliating is this discovery! Yet, how just a humiliation! Had I been in love, I could not have been more wretchedly blind. But vanity, not love, has been my folly. Pleased with the preference of one, and offended by the neglect of the other, on the very beginning of our acquaintance, I have courted prepossession and ignorance, and driven reason away, where either were concerned. Till this moment I never knew myself." Elizabeth, Volume 2, Chapter 13. In this moment, Elizabeth realizes how much her pride and prejudice have affected her judgment, even though she has criticized Darcy for the same narrow-mindedness. She believed Wickham's story despite the obvious signs of his dishonesty, and she also wanted to believe the worst about Darcy. Once Elizabeth recognizes her faults, she does not wallow in them. Instead, she takes the opportunity to improve her attitude and finally admit her feelings for Darcy. "I have been a selfish being all my life, in practice, though not in principle. As a child I was taught what was right, but I was not taught to correct my temper. I was given good principles, but left to follow them in pride and conceit. Unfortunately an only son, for many years an only child, I was spoilt by my parents, who, though good themselves, my father, particularly, all that was benevolent and amiable, allowed, encouraged, almost taught me to be selfish and overbearing, to care for none beyond my own family circle, to think meanly of all the rest of the world, to wish at least to think meanly of their sense and worth compared with my own. Such I was, from 8 to 28, and such I might still have been but for you, dearest, loveliest Elizabeth. What do I not owe you? You taught me a lesson, hard indeed at first, but most advantageous. By you, I was properly humbled. I came to you without a doubt of my reception. You showed me how insufficient were all my pretensions to please a woman worthy of being pleased. Mr. Darcy, Volume 3, Chapter 16. This passage is the climax of Darcy's journey to self-discovery. By admitting that he proposed to Elizabeth without a doubt of his reception, Darcy acknowledges that his class prejudice clouded his judgment. After Elizabeth's rebuke, Darcy came to realize that a person's manner is more important than his or her social status. He has since achieved a level of self-awareness that will enable his future happiness. Finally, this statement reflects the importance that Austen places on the family unit educating its children, since Darcy sees his Shore Pride and Prejudice summary and analysis of Volume I, Chapters 1 to 6. Summary. Chapter 1. The novel begins at Longbourn, at the Bennet family estate. The Bennets are immersed in an in-depth conversation about Mr. Bingley, a single man of large fortune who is soon to inhabit the nearby estate of Netherfield Park. Mrs. Bennet hopes that Mr. Bingley will be a potential suitor for one of her daughters. She desperately wants her husband to visit him, hoping that will spark an acquaintance. Mr. Bennet remains aloof, however, and refuses to commit. His attitude infuriates his wife, whose primary life concern is finding